Hello and welcome to day 35, I think, of my alternative spring tour. This is in fact my final week and it's my final chat, and I'm very delighted and honoured to welcome my guest today, Dr. Naomi Paxton, who is a performer, a broadcaster, a writer, a researcher, and truly in this little series that I've been doing over the last week, a remarkable woman. So hello, Naomi.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for agreeing to this crazy thing that I'm doing. In this session, Naomi and I have sort of had a little chat about the approach we would take, because I've been trying to mix up the focus of each of the conversations that I've done over the last 5 weeks. And we thought it would be nice, that's a very nothing kind of word, anyway, that it would be a good idea to indeed beam in on some remarkable women who we've known or admired throughout our lives. They may be alive, they may not be alive, and to also imagine inviting them to a dinner party. So these would be a handful of people who we would choose to invite as dinner guests. So basically, that's what we're going to do. Mine's a very eclectic mixture, and you know, these lists are by no means exhaustive, I know. First of all, I would like to ask you one or two questions about yourself, so that people watching this get to know you if they don't know you already, and a little bit about sort of what you do. And I mentioned the various hats at the beginning, and that always sort of fascinates me when people have different strings to their bow. And so I've sort of got 3 questions in one, really, and you can choose to answer it however you want to.
Okay.
Which is about sort of how do you juggle all of those hats? Which came first? And I would love for you to tell me a little bit more about how Ada evolved.
Okay. First part of the question, how do I juggle them? Sometimes successfully, sometimes poorly, which has continued during this lockdown period. Which came first? I think performer came first. That was always my dream since I was a child, to be an actor on stage particularly. So I think performer came first, and I went to university, then I went to drama school, and then I worked as an actor for a decade before I got into the academia side of things, which was entirely a surprise. Ada came about. Ada Campe is a cabaret comedy magic character that I've been doing for a long time. And she kind of came about because of my love, really, of music hall, variety, silly comedy. I was a junior member of the Players Theatre Club when I was a teenager, which was the theatre under Charing Cross Station, the kind of old-time music hall theatre, and I used to go along and see that. And I also used to go and see the Comedy Store Players when I was a teenager as well. And I love the kind of inventiveness and the silliness and the communication with the audience. So I ended up getting a job when I was an actor obviously in a late night magic cabaret show at Jermyn Street Theatre in Piccadilly Circus as a sort of comedy magician's assistant. So sort of harridan wife to this magician. So he was the magic and I was the kind of the gurning and the misdirection, as it were. And this kind of, I'd done bits of comedy before, radio comedy and sketch comedy, but this kind of sort of monster began to emerge, and it was just super fun. And it kind of combined the dressing up and the silliness and the communication with the audience and the playfulness, because it was a comedy magic show, so it was very playful. And then eventually, yeah.
Sorry, I love a couple of things you said there, and I obviously we've got quite a bit to get through, so I won't dwell on this too much, but your story does really interest me. And one of the other things I was going to ask you was whether you performed as a child, you know, whether you did Amdram or whatever it was, because not all of my creativity, but certainly the singing and the songwriting and this project that I've done more recently with writing a book and the exhibition have all come sort of in later life, really.
Okay.
So I did nothing as a child. I'd never
Oh,
done any Amdram. I'd never sung in a choir or anything until I was.
okay.
So I was interested to know, you know, if things started for you when you were young, and you've answered.
Well, my mum's a ballet teacher, so I was lots of dance experience, and I was going to acting summer schools. I was having voice lessons. I also played the harp and the piano, and sang as well. So I spent a couple of years at Trinity College of Music, my last year of sixth form, and then my gap year, doing harp and piano and singing, actually. But I kind of realised that I cared about acting more than, or was prepared to work harder at acting than I was at music. So I was very lucky. I had lots of support for music and dance, and in acting actually as well. So yes, Amdram. And I had a real drive. I just had a real drive to do it. Yeah.
Really. And you also mentioned playfulness, which is a lovely word. And that came up in the conversation I had with Griselda Canmusset last week. Mm-hmm. And so that's fabulous, that actually, you know, there is this thing. Clearly I've chosen playful people to talk to. Yeah. Maybe that's the thing, or people who are searching for playfulness, you know, in a time at the moment where we're having to sort of create playfulness for ourselves as well.
Yeah, well, that's just to finish. One of the things about Ada Campe, that character, is just there's a playful energy to her that means that she can play with, you know, late night cabaret audiences, sort of, that are maybe quite blue or quite drunk or quite naughty, but also kind of kids shows, big variety shows, one-on-one things. Because the essential energy is good and communicative and curious, and that energy is a beautiful space to be in on stage. And it's also a beautiful space to be in when you're thinking about, because I think about theatre, because I'm now a theatre historian as well, another hat. So, but if you think about theatre and performance as that space of communication, rather than just what's on the page or just what's in the archive, then having an awareness of the practicalities of that and the pleasure of that from both sides kind of opens up that world in a different way, I think.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. And again, to people watching this, do check Naomi out and Ada out, and there are plenty of recent performances, virtual performances actually, as well as archives and so on her website, and I'll give you the address at the end when I post this.
Thank you.
Lovely little. And the other thing I hasten to add again, which I will flag up when I post this, is that Naomi presents BBC Radio 3's Free Thinking from time to time, and will actually be presenting a programme next week, I believe, June the 4th.
It's about tackling modern slavery.
Tune into that for more of Naomi's brilliance, insight. So, shall we move on to see who we would invite to this dinner party?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to invite you to say who the first guest on your list would be.
Well, I think the first guest on my list would be my 9, actually, Dilys Brooks, who is who's a wonderful character, and an amazing, remarkable woman who juggled life and children. She was a forces wife, so lived all over the world, but also was a huge stalwart. Both her and my grandfather were huge stalwarts of their sort of forces, Amdram. And I have a cup up here for both of them for their work, and I have pictures and programmes and reviews, and their passion for performance and curiosity and playfulness, and her strength and humour is wonderful. And I'd love to spend an evening at a dinner party, and she would be fantastic company. So she's my first guest, my 9, Dilys Brooks.
Interesting that we've both chosen. So for those of you who don't know what a 9 is, it's Welsh for grandmother. In my book, so I may as well talk about my 9. In my book, I talk a little bit about my maternal grandmother, and I sort of put it into context of her own parents, actually, who died when she was terribly young. So my maternal great grandfather was a rector in a Welsh valley. And both of her parents, my grandmother's parents were dead by the time she was 10. And she had 2, if not 3 brothers. Little is known about a third one. And this is going back. I'm a little bit older than Naomi, so it's all relative. My grandmother was educated, had a very good education despite that. She was, and we suppose that it was paid for by the clergy. So she went to Howell School in Denbigh, and then she went to Cambridge, and she actually qualified, if that's the right word really, but you'll see why I say that, in 1915 with a mathematics tripos from Cambridge. Now, that was years before women got the vote, let alone women being awarded degrees, certainly at Cambridge, which wasn't until 1947, at Oxford in 1921. So it was absolutely remarkable. And the thing was that I lived in the same house as her until I was 13, and then she didn't die until I was 16. So I lived in very close proximity to her, but, I still wish that I could sit down with her, at a dinner party perhaps, and really find out more about those early years and so on. There was, I've done a little bit of research into her sort of background and so on, and there's a certain amount that we know. And I do have a recollection from when I was growing up, when I was a child, that she would sort of almost shudder if she mentioned the word workhouse, because there was actually a workhouse near to this village where she was born, and I suppose had her early years. And I guess, but for the clergy paying for her education, who knows? And I think that was probably something that she was conscious of, actually. So that's interesting that we've started with our grandmothers. So who would perhaps be sitting next to your 9?
Well, I've chosen a woman called Cicely Hamilton, who is a suffragist, playwright and actress and journalist that I researched. So I researched the professional theatre wing of the suffrage movement, theatre very broadly, theatre and entertainments. And Cicely Hamilton is an amazing person, and she's very dry. And I feel like I probably babble and be a bit stupid and impressed by her. And I desperately want to impress her, and she'd just be very...
I think we all do that in certain...
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like she just sort of quietly sort of whatever it would be. But I love, she's an interesting, passionate, clever woman who managed to turn, I think, some of the most kind of frustrating, political turmoil or governments you don't agree with or frustrations can be so annoying, and it's hard to zoom out. And she managed to use her creativity to make things funny and light and be very clever about the point she was making in a time of enormous turmoil. And she had an incredibly long career. I think she'd be fascinating, but I'd have to try and pluck up courage to speak to her. So I thought, if I sit her next to my 9's very intelligent and lovely. So hopefully they'd have a conversation and I'd sneak in and try and work out how I could go in. So Cicely Hamilton would be my...
Okay. Well, talking of people who, you might be slightly in awe of and babble with, that did slightly happen to me a few years ago. So I have also put on my list, it is a real weird mixture. I've actually put Emma Peel. And in my book, I have a little section. I have a section called A Handful of Passions. And one of my passions growing up, and still, I guess, therefore, was the Avengers. And I mean the original Avengers.
Right.
And certainly the Emma Peel episodes. And we had to get a new TV some years ago just so that I could watch a box set of all the Emma Peel episodes that I'd bought that was an American format and wouldn't work on our existing TV. But I would choose Emma Peel. But actually what happened a few years ago, after I brought up my first album in 2016, I wrote a song called Me and Mrs. Peel. And we used to get invited to the university in conversations, interestingly, and dinners that went on afterwards. And one of them was down a rig. And the person who was in charge of coordinating the guest lists was familiar with this album and that I just brought stuff out and everything. So she put us on the top table with Gavin Esler, who was hosting it. And there were only 8 of us on the table. We brought 2 guests, and they put me next to Diana Rigg. And it was a bit, so I was placed in between Diana Rigg and the woman who she should really have had on her other side, apart from Gavin Esler on her left. And she was completely bemused as to why this strange woman dressed from top to toe in black was sitting. It was actually quite difficult, really. And I guess for me, it was slightly surreal, and maybe just burst my bubble a little bit, actually, because it was actually just slightly awkward, really. So I would probably choose Emma Peel, as, you know, the fictitious character, really. And maybe I would still be slightly speechless and babbling, you know. I'm not sure if I was or not really with Diana Rigg herself, but I felt a little embarrassed by it all, really. So, your next guest.
My next guest is a brilliant woman called Claire-Louise Hardy, who is better known online as the Thrifty Stitcher. She's an amazing costumier and tailor and maker. And she was involved with the kind of Great British Sewing Bee at the beginning, and she's written lots of books and things. But when I was an actor and I was out of work, I just wanted to work in the theatre. So my out of work jobs were box office in various West End shows and dressing on various West End shows. So I've worked on, I think, nearly 30 West End shows as a dresser, as plays and musicals and all sorts. And one of the wardrobe mistresses I've worked with so much is Claire-Louise Hardy, who's fantastic, and CL, she's known by. And her work ethic, her kind of calmness, I just trusted her. So in the day, she'd be this brilliant, efficient, wonderful woman who's managing huge companies and huge amounts of costumes and all kinds of stuff. And then we go out at night and drink and dance and end up in ballads and then drink and then stumble around in the morning in like Spitalfields Market kind of coming to. And I just admire her. I admire her such a lot. She's so talented at what she does. She's turned her hand to so many things within her industry. And I think is now doing an MA actually at the V&A around costume making. I just think she's a fantastic woman. I'd quite like to be her when I grow up. I think she's brilliant. So yeah, CL, or the Thrifty Stitcher, will be my next guest. I don't spend enough time with her, even before lockdown. We've always been so busy.
There you are, you see, this might prompt it.
We text every 6 months going, let's meet up. And then 6 months later, let's meet up. So yes, this would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to... my next one, there was when you were talking about stumbling about after nights out and things, I did have an automatic link really in terms of I will do exactly that actually. So in terms of stumbling about after good nights out, and we talked before we came on air about the Westminster Gym, because we have that in common. And my very first job, co-running the Westminster Gym for 18 months when it was located in the Norman Shaw building, and it catered to anybody who worked in the Palace of Westminster, so MPs, Lords, the press, you name it. And it was probably the most fascinating job that I was ever to have, and I had quite a few very interesting ones.
When was that? What years were that?
It was there from 1983 for a year and a half.
Wow.
And during that time, sort of at the end of my probably first year, basically I was the centre of a sexual discrimination situation, where my boss was leaving. They wanted, long and short of it was, because it's quite a lengthy tale and that's not what I really want to talk about, is that they brought in a young guy to become my boss, and I had to teach him his job and everything. We got on fabulously, but prior to that, when all of this kicked off, it caused a huge stir, and we had people joining the gym, paying their 100 quid or something, which is all it was then, like Harriet Harman actually, and various, you know, significant people joining to try and support this my case, basically, and signing petitions. And so I would like to invite Harriet Harman to this dinner, and I'd like to invite her with a friend who was there at the time, who was a member of the gym, who sadly is no longer with us, who, because she's one of the feistiest women I've ever known, she's one of the most loyal friends anybody could have. She fought my corner, you know, with so much determination and whatever. But so I would have them there together because they were both supporting my cause. And for the reasons I've sort of said. For Harriet Harman, I would love to talk to her about the obvious thing, which is, does she have any regrets about not becoming the Labour leader? And I would have Janet there just simply because she would be extraordinary value. And we got up to an awful lot of mischief as well, and stumbled around an awful lot after good nights out, as you did with your friend. So those are two more guests at the table who I think would provide a very good evening for us.
This is shaping up to be a brilliant night.
I feared my list was rather long when I started, and then I thought, oh dear, this is going to be, you know, and also it's better to be sitting around a round table, really, isn't it? And actually, you can only a round table that's so big, really. But I'm sort of going off into my imagination now. So who would be next on your guest list?
Well, this is someone I've never met, but I've read about. This is somebody called Mrs. Salmon. Mrs. Salmon, who way before Madame Tussaud was born, Mrs. Salmon ran a waxworks emporium in Fleet Street on the Strand, or just off the Strand. And she had these moving waxworks. They were clockwork waxworks. And I'm just massively intrigued by this whole phenomena. So apparently, I'm just checked. So she had, she one figure represented, there's an English prophetess known as Mother Shipton. And apparently there was a secret treadle on the floor. So when you walk past her, her knee would move and she'd kick you out of the room. This is in 1711. This is in the middle of London. And I'm now the one.
I'm going to have to look all these people up.
Mrs. Salmon. My one big phobia, is waxworks. For no reason at all. I've never been attacked by a waxwork, but I just have a thing about waxworks. So I wouldn't want ever to go to her emporium. But I would love to talk to her about clockwork, about arranging people, about kind of the public tastes, about what it's like being a woman in business at that time, and just find out more about the technology of that, because she's doing that, yes, sort of in the years Madame Tussaud is born. But the whole clockwork automata, I love clockwork and automata, and the whole storytelling with clockwork and automata in a sort of immersive in storytelling environment off the Strand just intrigues me. So I'd get Mrs. Salmon in just to sit and listen to her.
Well, I think that's the thing actually with a lot of these people. It's just about sitting and listening. So, you know, give them dangle a carrot, let them go. Actually, and I think that, you know, that's the beauty sometimes of some of these people who are so interesting and have so much to offer in terms of how they've lived their lives and so on. I'm going to drop in for just a bit of, I'm going to sort of again do two in one here, for a bit of glamour, and I focused on I did a short reading a few days ago. I'm losing track of my tour, and it was about an amazing woman called Yana, who I had the privilege of working with in the 80s, a few years after the Westminster Gym. And we were working together at Harrods in the fitness equipment department, which is a bit weird because actually she had been a very well-known singer in the 50s, had her own TV program and all sorts of things. And I would invite her because she would add a huge amount of glamour, for one thing, but also I don't think I ever really, and we were good friends for a few years until she sadly died, quite young really. I don't think I ever really talked to her about what that experience of having been a really big star in the 50s was like, especially when then pop music came along. And kind of, that was it really. You know, her star faded very rapidly and she ended up working in Boots and Marylebone Road and then at Harrods, you know, and that must have been an extraordinary sort of transition. But also I would have her for the glamour, and had a wicked sense of humour, and I sense that a lot of these women around this probably have that. So, and I would have to throw in, as it's a singing thing, I just have to put Dusty in there just because, really, for no more, just because I've been a lifelong fan of Dusty and so on. So, who else would you have on your?
Okay, well, to continue the musical theme.
Oh.
And continue the kind of sneaking a few under one. Luckily, a cab has arrived with 3 people in the back of it. Just extravagant. All welcome at once. Car sharing.
And will they be left in?
So in the back there, we've got Victoria Wood.
Oh, yeah.
Who I just adored. I used to pause the video of her singing and write down each lyric as it was happening and learn her monologues off by heart when I was young. I just loved her. Then there is Lady Leisha, who is a grime MC who I just adore. I think she's so clever. Her use of language is so clever. Her rhymes, her bars are amazing. And one of my sort of, if I can't sleep, one of my favourite things to do is to look up people reacting to Lady Leisha online if they've never seen her, and they just go, oh my God, she's so clever. She is so clever.
That's not awake.
Sorry? Yeah.
Does that not keep you awake?
Well, no, but it's lovely because I really admire her storytelling and her kind of her pithiness about the way she tells stories and represents herself. And the third would be Nellie McKay, who is a US singer-songwriter, who again presents very differently. She presents as a very kind of chocolate box, very pretty, sort of blonde, unthreatening persona, and then sings these wonderful songs that are really cutting and critical about feminism, for example, or ideas of marriage and womanhood. And I think she's just very bold and brave. So and secretly, I would love one day to do a project with Lady Leisha and Nellie McKay, somehow working on it. So I want them to meet if they don't know each other already. And I just admire their use of language. Again,
yeah, okay. I'm going to again do a double thing here. The first one, they're going to be my last 2 guests actually. The first one I'm not going to sort of dwell on too much, but again, and I refer to my book because that's partly what this is all about. I mentioned Martha Gellhorn quite a lot in my book, and because there are quite a number of travel stories in my book, and there are many travel escapades of my own and adventures that didn't make it in, which might be a little project I move on to when I have recovered from this. But Martha Gellhorn are just fascinating. And I was actually, I referred to a book of hers called Travels with Myself and Another 5 Journeys from Hell, which sort of inspired some of the travel stories that I wrote about and gave me a bit of a hook. And I was searching for it last night and I couldn't find it. And I found a great big tome, which is a biography about her. And then when I was sitting here this morning, just sort of getting ready to speak to you, I spotted it on the shelf. And it's acerbic wit and just fabulous stories, and of course what an amazing woman, and her links to Hemingway and so on. My final guest, and probably for me somebody I just admire so enormously, and had the good fortune to bump into a few years ago quite by chance, is the writer Jan Morris. And broadcaster, journalist, writer, still going at 93 or something. What an amazing life, and fascinating still to listen to. I actually listened to 1 or 2 podcasts last night, with her talking to Jim Nocte about her book Venice and so on. She was the first person, when she was James Morris, to report back from Everest when that was conquered, and of course wrote the amazing book called Conundrum, about her transition from male to female, which I read when I was about 16 and was just completely smitten by. And what a fabulous human being, apart from the brilliance and so on. And my father is in a nursing home near Crickeith in North Wales, and a few years ago when I was up there visiting him, I went to the little post office in Crickeith, and I did know that Jan Morris and her partner, who she had to divorce, who was her wife, who divorced when she underwent her sex change, and then they had a civil partnership many years later. So they've always lived together. So I did know that they lived nearby, but actually this was a sort of thing where I was a little bit speechless. I was looking at the stationery in this poky little post office, and I turned around. There was Jan Morris standing at the checkout desk. And I nearly wasn't going to say anything. And then I thought, I have to. This person I just revere so much. And talk about, I then read afterwards that two of her favourite things in life are kindness and marmalade. What a generous person. She was so charming and so kind to me, and hoped that we'd meet again and everything. And but a fascinating life and travel writer, amazing. And I've just ordered the book Conundrum because I want to reread it. So Jan Morris would be my final guest, and I would encourage people heartily to check out, if they can listen to a podcast, read any of her books and so on. Incredible. So do you have a final guest? Or?
I do. I'm going to sneak in Adeline Bourne, who was one of the founder members of the Actresses Franchise League in 1908. She was Anglo-Indian, born in India, but had lived a fascinating life. And I like to listen to podcasts. I've never heard her voice, and I nearly had the chance. I found she lived well into her 90s and continued campaigning her whole life. And there was an interview with her done, I think it was in the 50s, when she was just in her early 90s. And I found that the BFI had a recording of this interview. So I was desperate to go and see it and hear her speak. And they said, actually, we don't know why, but the audio reel has gone from it completely. We've no idea why. We've no record of it going, but it's just the visual. So I went to the BFI screening rooms with a deaf actor friend of mine who grew up in a hearing family. So he is an amazing lip reader. And then a lovely friend of mine who's a sign language interpreter, a BSL interpreter. So we went to try and watch this footage to see if we could get anything of her words and what she was saying. We had a hilarious afternoon, unfortunately not, because not only was she filmed in all sorts of angles from the black and white footage, but she was terribly posh and she had false teeth in. So we couldn't really get anything. So all you could see was going, ha, 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 and we just laughed. And the guy kept coming through going, "You all right?" Because we were just laughing so much, because I was so full of optimism we would get something. And but anyway, we didn't get anything, but had a lovely time. But I'd love to hear her speak, finally. She'd know Cicely Hamilton, so that's okay. And I'd love to hear about her life campaigning and her juggling of many different hats, actually.
Yeah.
Her juggling of professional industry, of activism, of advocacy. That would be wonderful to finally hear her voice. This
would be an extraordinary table of people, of women. And, I suspect that some of their paths would have crossed anyway. Equally, it would be amazing to bring them together and to just almost be a fly on the wall, really, to see what evolved in terms of conversation and humour and so on.
Thank you for this opportunity to think of them all there as well. That's just a really...
Yeah, I think what sort of sprung to mind a moment ago is that I will actually write down a list of all of these people. So if you'd be good enough to email me the names of these people, any links or anything, and I'll put this out on the post as well, because I certainly would love to research some of these people who you've introduced me to, and and so on, and hopefully other people would be interested to do the same. So that kind of probably brings our dinner party to a close. So we've done coffee and petit four, I think, probably by now. And our coaches have arrived. But this has been such a privilege and a joy, and I can't think of a finer way to bring my tour to a close. I do have something quite special to share with people tomorrow, but yeah, just immense pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you today, and I hope that we'll get the chance to see each other again before too long.
Yes, absolutely, and likewise. Thank you so much for asking me, and congratulations on harnessing the energy of this tour.
I'm not sure where I am.
Circumstances.
And look, thank you so much. It's been fantastic, and what fun! I've had a ball. Thank you. Bye.